fine. Sometimes it makes me sound like I've got an English accent. So again, thank you, Sam. Thank you to the attendees for carving out the time today. Whether you're joining us live or watching the recording, probably for the next, say, 57 minutes or so, Patrick and I plan to spend less time on telling you what to do. Rather, we'll be imparting anecdotes and, dare I say, wisdom on ways we've experienced interoperability advancing value-based care. For our agenda today, we'll cover our perspective on challenges faced, considerations to be mindful of, and strategies to approach interoperability as a tool to support value-based care. And as Sam mentioned, we'll have time at the end for questions, and I really would encourage an inquisition from you. And then at the end of that, we'll maybe finish with a few final thoughts just to finish off the session. But before all that, and hopefully you can see the slide transition, as Sam mentioned, I have a guest speaker joining me today. Please allow me to introduce you to Patrick Burton. For over a decade and a half, Patrick has pioneered transformation within healthcare IT. And today, as Vice President at Lightbeam Health Solutions, Patrick has phenomenal expertise on today's topics of interoperability and value-based care.
Thanks, Mark. Mark's not too shabby himself. He comes to the table with a tremendous amount of experience around the development and delivery of really innovative solutions that assist both provider and payer collaboration.
Oh, thank you, Patrick. Very gracious. So I think before we get into any substantive detail, I think there are a few housekeeping items that were important groundwork for the rest of our discussion today. I think first, maybe as a caveat, this won't be a technical discussion, a heavy technical discussion, at least for the most part anyway. Rather, I think our aim is to talk about developing frameworks around interoperability relative to value-based care.
That's exactly right. And, we were kind of joking earlier, we could have probably just as easily flipped the script a little bit and called this presentation Leveraging Value-Based Care to Advance Interoperability, kind of flipping the coin, so to speak. From our perspective as solution providers, operational strategy and business strategy sits upstream from and actually informs or drives technical development and not the other way around. If you've ever seen an application or a piece of software that might check all of the technical boxes, but then in practical use doesn't really have any practical usability or workflow, you'll know kind of what I'm referencing.
Yeah, exactly. I think the predominant takeaway for this presentation will be to apply what you learned to your own unique situations and increase readiness to further your own transformations towards value-based care.
So building on that, and to make this meaningful, we're going to first define a couple terms relative to our approach today and kind of how we're framing the discussion or presentation. You might think these would be obvious, but in our experience, there's a wide gap in how people understand or interpret these topics, right? If you ask one person what value-based care is, you're going to get one answer, and that might vary dramatically from who else you might ask. But for today, when we reference interoperability, really what we're talking about is the ability to exchange, or even the actual exchanging of data and information to support clinical and administrative workflows. And then when we reference value-based care, really what we're talking about has to do with the care delivery models and kind of support structures around them that are driven by risk-sharing arrangements between providers and payers, with the goal really of improving the triple aim, right? We want to increase quality, we want to reduce cost, we want to improve the patient experience, or dare I say the quadruple aim and include the provider experience as well. But before we get too far, we'll take a few minutes and describe the steepening hill that we all have to climb.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, I think really as I say here, in the digital age, healthcare really is stuck in analog, and I think despite investment from the US government, private enterprises, and even despite provider officers' own assessments of themselves, each year we see an industry reliant on telephone and fax. It's estimated we're spending about $15 billion annually on faxes in healthcare. And even worse, I saw one calculation late last year from the National Bureau of Economic Research. It was a bit of a dry read, but an interesting stat that $150 billion is estimated to be spent processing $50 billion worth of claims. Facts is still the primary, and I think I would say not to be confused with preferred, because I don't think it is, way that things like authorizations are processed. And it's inertia around these types of workflows that's a huge impediment to innovation in adjacent workflows like value-based care. And without pouring too much salt into the wound, as I say here, I feel that the current path is unsustainable. And whether you believe me or not, the organizations like MedPAC, a non-partisan legislative branch that provides Congress with analytics and specific advice on Medicare, sent a report to Congress. Actually, this chart that you can see, I point to my screen on the other side, is actually where it was the source material for this chart. And in that report, it reaffirmed a few things. First, healthcare spending as a share of GDP continues to grow, presently around about 18%. And government spending on Medicare and other major healthcare programs is projected to exceed total federal revenues, you heard me right, total federal revenues by 2038. So what we've seen on those last two slides is there's been decades of spending, no shortage of efforts to legislate. I think we've all had experience on that on the line, and still minimal progress across the industry. And I will caveat that comment on minimal progress. I think that's really at an aggregate level. I'm sure there's some experiences on the line where progress has been made at an institutional level, but at an aggregate level, I think what I hope we can all agree on is progress has been minimal. And I think through that same aggregate lens, things like payer-provider abrasion hasn't eased, nor has the pharmaceutical industry's approach to things like value-based reimbursement. And as I said to Patrick, please don't get me started on rebate models and the impediments that exist there.
Yeah, this isn't a 4-hour webinar, right? Because I've heard that diatribe once or twice. Kind of to add to what Mark is saying, I haven't seen an updated projection that's looked at data in the last couple of years, but based on the last information that I have referenced, it indicates that CMS is looking at insolvency in the 2026 2027 range, really, and for all intents and purposes the next 5 years. And the scarier thing is that those projections really did not factor in any of the trillions of newly printed stimulus dollars that were necessarily appropriated to help with some of the relief in dealing with the pandemic, and certainly says nothing to the downstream inflation that we're starting to experience as a result of expanding the money supply. The other interesting and kind of looming crisis that will probably become more and more topical as we go through and actually transition more into value-based care has to do with really simple supply and demand of resources. I think we're fairly well aware of, and to some extent trying to respond to, anticipated shortages around providers, and particularly primary care providers, which we've kind of been reporting on and have been aware of for quite some time. But as the world becomes more value-based, we're also going to start running into shortages of nurse care managers and medical coders, right? So looking at tools like interoperability and the ability to automate things really becomes front and center as these supply pools change, right? Because whenever supply goes down, demand goes up, cost goes up, and it's going to be very difficult to retain large amounts of staff to just kind of throw bodies at these problems moving forward. Now, if we all agree, kind of putting a bow on that, if we all agree that the challenges we face require, coordinated and significant action, then I thought what we would do is maybe frame a few of the items that have served and will probably continue to serve as hurdles as we go along the way. So what we thought we would do is just cover a couple things, a few areas to be mindful of that are pretty specific to value-based care. And some of this might be obvious, especially for the folks on the phone that are probably nodding on the other end and kind of live and breathe this stuff. But given the inherent and kind of deeply rooted nature of our legacy fee-for-service approach, payers and providers have historically been at odds with each other. providers benefit from more volume, payers benefit from less, just kind of at the, the 100,000-foot view. And value-based care really can't happen at scale until we all kind of lay our weapons down, so to speak, and get on the same page.
Well, and Patrick, with that in mind and understanding that dynamic, how do you think we as an industry can move past things that have been counterproductive historically?
So at a high level, we really need to start by seeking and working on things that we all agree around, right? So looking at two maybe high level things that can drive material change and maybe avoid us reverting into more of a tit for tat volley. First, we must agree that all the decisions that we make are made with the best interests of the patients above all else. Ultimately, that's why we're all here, including us vendors. And secondly, we must believe that the challenges of healthcare quality, access, and affordability are significant enough and urgent enough to require dramatic change, right? Hence a little bit of maybe some of the fear mongering we just promoted over the past couple slides, right? The bleak reality that we face if we do nothing and stand still. So from our perspective, commitment to change is a must, regardless of interoperability. And that really includes commitment to each other as provider to provider, provider to network, provider to payer, and vice versa, all the various iterations in between.
I mean,
we're even seeing, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, because I think, Patrick, you do bring up an interesting point, and sorry to cut you off, but I mean, I don't see anyone advocating an anti-value-based care sentiment, and I don't think there'll be anyone on the line that's taking that position either. But one thing I would say is we still really haven't seen the same kind of tailwind that say the EDI industry realized with the introduction of HIPAA X12 transaction sets, if that wasn't too deep into things, or indeed that the EHR industry felt in the mid 2000s during some of the meaningful use certification era. So I don't know what comments you'd have there.
Yeah, well, the good news, right, the tailwind that we have is that there's actually an appetite on both the payer and the provider side to move more deeply into value-based care. The predominant challenge, or one of the biggest challenges we face, really has to do with the hurdles from a technical perspective that are preventing further adoption and even limiting some of these outcomes that we all agree are on the table if we can better organize how we interact with each other and work with each other. Many would argue, I think I would also fall in that camp, that value-based care has not been adopted really at levels that were initially positioned in early projections. And many of these barriers are data related, right? I mean, gosh, if we poll the average provider, at least in my experience, we'll hear things like, well, there isn't enough data, or there's too much data, or yes, we have data, but it's not timely, or yes, we have data, but it's not accurate. These aren't my patients are sick, or all the kind of very data related items that we continue to struggle with. And, really, absent thoughtful or meaningful solutions to this problem, any new task, no matter how well-intentioned or how good of an idea it is, from a value-based perspective, it's going to be categorized and lumped into administrative burden. I think that kind of calls back to that stat that you threw up earlier that, it costs, I think it was $150 billion to process $50 billion in claims. But again, the good news is that this challenge presents a tremendous opportunity for us to get better alignment between payers and providers so that they can come to the table and really address it together from the same side of the table.
No, so good comments there. I think to maybe throw a cat amongst the pigeons, how do patients fit into this mix? I mean, obviously we'll spend a good bit of our discussion today addressing payers and providers, but are there catalysts to be drawn from patients, especially as healthcare consumerism changes and rapidly evolves?
Oh, no doubt, absolutely. So patients are evolving as digital consumers at a rate that dramatically outpaces the healthcare industry's ability to respond, right? So when you add in a pandemic that drove this concept of quote unquote, remote everything, convenience has rapidly become a much higher priority in the lives of many, with tasks that were kind of routinely done face to face, right? We're effectively isolated on purpose in some regards now. And I can personally attest to this. I'm the proxy for my grandmother's personal health record, and I can say that the difference in how I am engaged by her hospital as her proxy and how I'm engaged by my my Mint financial banking app is, light years apart. This vacuum actually creates opportunities for outsider companies that we've seen kind of pop up in recent times, like Hims and Rowe, to become billion-dollar enterprises virtually overnight. So I'll position maybe a few questions that might be interesting to model out at some point in a different discussion, right? As providers, how will your practices differentiate from more convenience forward and virtual first type options? As payers, how will you respond to these market shifts more rapidly so that you're better supporting the member engagement and the network engagement that's required to really adopt these things more quickly? And the potentially the scariest thought, what if these new convenience first options become their own payers, right? That's entirely disruptive. But like I said, the good news is we have the opportunity to change. It's right in front of our face.
Yeah, no, some good comments there. Thanks for that. So we've done a bit of hand wringing about value-based care, but how does interoperability fit within the conversation? What should we understand about interoperability as a tool to advance value-based care?
Yeah, and the way that we're looking to frame this maybe is not necessarily to talk about what interoperability is, but maybe to bring up some popular misconceptions about what it is, and maybe go into a little bit about what, at least from our perspectives, what it isn't. In recent interactions and several interactions over my career, a lot of folks, I think, are mistaken in the belief or putting too many eggs in the interoperability basket as being kind of a black box or turnkey solution, right? If we only had X, then we'll be able to solve Y. And it might ruffle a few feathers, but if your solution to, or your answer to the question of how do we engage providers more meaningfully such that we influence their behavior and make more better data informed decisions, if your answer to that question is, oh, easy, smart, on fire, I'm afraid you might be in for dare I say, a rude awakening when you actually try to present information to providers for the first time.
Patrick, that could be considered a fairly hot take for a number of individuals on the line. So what would you offer to maybe help make that perception a little bit more complete?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So in some cases, maybe as an olive branch, in some cases, maybe that perception might be true. But on the whole, we like to frame, at least from our perspectives, interoperability is simply being a prerequisite capability rather than a complete solution, right? I think of interoperability really being more the electrical grid and the delivery of power, but not necessarily the appliance, right? And how we take that electricity and turn that into something productive into our lives and our daily workflows. Case in point, when we at Lightbeam were in our really in our infancy, we overestimated what the continuity of care document as a standard would do for us based on how effective it was in helping with transitions of care from provider to provider, and kind of all of the great work we've seen relative to the HIE, or health information exchange arena. However, when we took a closer look and worked with a lot of our initial clients and really deeply examined CCDs through the lens of kind of population health management, which is largely based in mass data aggregation and analytics, we really had to come up with some special accommodations to manage that difference in purpose.
No, and you do bring up a good point there, Patrick. I think the especially as it relates to standards, because I think there's a joke that I can't remember if you told me or certainly been out there, but the best thing about standards is there are so many of them. So how do you recommend we approach standards?
So don't get me wrong, standards are great, right? Standards are really good when it comes to attaining kind of consensus or centralized agreement around maybe methods or contents of messages or formats or connectivity, those kinds of things. But they certainly don't always take into consideration things like personality preferences workflow differences, documentation practices, if we're talking about kind of providers interacting with their EHRs, unique or evolving business objectives, or the individual roles of the data, the consumers of that data themselves. By definition, standards are the enemy of nuance, and therefore they really, again, they provide an opportunity rather than the end solution.
No, and you make a good point there. I guess just looking at the slides, I mean, is this what you're referring to about the last mile?
Oh, totally. So as I've mentioned, maybe restated, standards aren't in the business of interpreting the data or telling you what that data means, right? It's upon the recipient systems and individuals to extract the value out of that data to make it meaningful for them. The concept I'm about to share has been kind of retooled and expressed differently throughout the past, and I'll probably put my own spin on it as well. But essentially, we're all in the business of taking data, transforming it into information, taking that information, transforming it to knowledge, transforming that knowledge to spur action, and then taking a look at the results of those actions to determine how we're doing from an outcomes perspective.
No, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think along those lines, though, because you kind of gave a nod to, I think it might be helpful to the audience if you offer up maybe a practical example or two.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So let's maybe take a topic that I think everybody would agree is a very, very important with our in line with our value-based goals. And let's talk about maybe transitional care management, or kind of management of transitions, and specifically how we look to incorporate admission, discharge, and transfer summary data, or ADT notifications, into that workflow. So within our own client base, and even within certain individual clients, we've seen actually multiple methods and formats of exchange that we have to deal with. Examples include, maybe we'll have an HL7 feed from one contributor and maybe MDM files from other contributors. But there's a whole vast difference between the receipt of that data and actually preventing a patient from being readmitted into the hospital, right? So beyond the approach of how we get the data, one of the other aspects that needs to be managed is the frequency or the timeliness of that data, right? As it's vital to respond and address specifically these patients as quickly as possible. Once those files hit, our integration servers, for example, the jobs of the standards are done and they've been successful, right? They've gotten the data from point A to point B. But not only does the frequency matter in the delivery of data from the suppliers, it also matters how frequently the system's responsible for notifying the end user personnel that data exists out there on an integration server, right? If we're pulling this data in daily, we've lost a fair amount of time that we could have otherwise spent hopping on that patient more quickly, gathering them right after that discharge, for example. So, frequency is often determined also at the discretion of the data supplier, right? Not necessarily the standard we choose to deploy.
Yeah, and maybe just building on that, I would imagine that problem is compounded when you factor in that often we see several different inbound streams of very similar data for any given payer or provider.
Oh, completely. I actually refer to this as the management of data collisions, where we're dealing with maybe multiple streams of data, and it might be the same data coming to us in different formats and maybe various frequencies. In this case, flexibility is really paramount. For starters, there's kind of the implied element of supporting multiple technical approaches, even within a single use case, kind of given our example before. But further, there's a procedural aspect to it, right? So adding to that transitional care management example, if I'm the care manager or the recipient responsible for taking action, I don't need to just know that the data is there and available to me, but I need to know when we receive that data, right? Because if that data is coming in daily from one feed and every 15 minutes in another feed, I need to know how my actions will differ to accommodate for that difference. And it can't be done, ideally it can't be done, in the old fashioned way of just writing that little rule down on a postcard and sticking it to my Post-it note and sticking it to my monitor, right? We ideally can manage that on behalf of the end user. Now, standards have been for ADT messages have been around for darn near 2 decades at this point. But given that, we're only recently seeing the kinds of solutions that really truly support those more real-time transitional care workflows. Calling back to one of the points that we mentioned before, we unfortunately won't have a decade or more to take that same operational leap in practical use for emerging initiatives like Smart on Fire. Smart on Fire, yes, I think it is our best hope for enabling the types of broad transition around clinical data sharing that we had been talking about largely for all this time. It really is a standard worth believing in. I mean, we're all in on Smart on Fire. However, due to the lag between the availability of a standard and the optimized use of that standard, many are having to resort to kind of more proprietary standards, or even in some cases manual methods to kind of plug those gaps in the meantime. So, for example, it's going to take quite some time for all of the EHR vendors to develop the ability not only to maybe represent Smart on Fire in their applications on a read-only basis, but to make them interactive, where we're adding discrete data back into the EHR from these objects. Therefore, there's a whole host of in our current state, there's a whole host of kind of one-to-one, point-to-point conversations between EHR vendors and other third parties like Lightbeam and NantHealth and others.
So I mean, I guess certainly this phenomenon isn't exclusive to provider data, right? I mean, what would you say about bringing payers into the mix?
Yeah, payers are enormous. Just as important, I would position relative to value-based care and kind of our goals of advancing value-based care. Albeit from a different angle, right? So with payers, we're really looking at the ability to share paid claims data with providers who participate in value-based contracts, right? We want to encourage them to take on more risk, and that includes downside risk. So kind of looking at the payer landscape and the state of affairs with claims integration, CMS has a fairly strong standard in their CCLF, and also its advancement toward more kind of standardized API-based exchange. But beyond that, it really is at this point the Wild West. We don't have an industry-wide kind of like an 837 or an 835 to consume and to share data about post-adjudicated claims yet. Much of our challenge as population health vendors, and dare I even say the bane of our existence, or a bane of our existence, is overcoming the lack of claims data being provided in a consistent, repeatable, or predictable fashion. The larger impediment in commercial claims data relative to payments is, how do we create a system that standardizes baseline reimbursement for those value-based line of business, so that we can eliminate kind of the volume-based fee schedule variances, and therefore eliminate the need for confidentiality between competitive fee schedules, right? If we're trying to urge providers to be more responsible for that kind of quote unquote whole healthcare dollar, or dollars spent globally for any given panel of patients, then it's fair to expect that we're going to need to show them more specifically how many of those dollars are spent by whom and where. But that's also a topic we won't have the time to cover or solve today.
Yeah, agreed, Patrick. So I guess then focusing back on what's in front of us, in reality, we're I guess, as you would say, we're dealing with a problem of too many and too few standards at the same time. I guess the nice paradox there. And I feel we've solidly covered some of the background and maybe many of the key concepts. But how can we take what we've learned and discussed and really actually translate that into meaningful kind of strategic development?
Wonderful. I'm glad you asked.
You're welcome.
So relative to strategy, maybe at a high level, it might be fair for us to take strategy and kind of compartmentalize it into two buckets, right? Let's look at strategy as being maybe internal and external, since the realm of kind of what's ideal versus what's possible or what's reality might differ depending on how much you have over, as far as control is concerned, over these various internal and external stakeholders. So for starters, if we're looking at internal strategy, it helps with really kind of getting really basic with it and defining what does internal mean to you? And that largely is going to depend on kind of the seat that you have at the table or what your personal point of view is, right? So on the provider side, that might mean, for a provider specifically, that might mean their clinic or their practice, right? It might be limited to their four walls. For an executive at an accountable care organization or clinically integrated network, it might be a consortium of independent practices for which you're in kind of various unique arrangements with contractually. For a payer, it's a little bit more cut and dry because you kind of have your organization, and then you have everything external is kind of defined as being your network, or maybe some providers if you're entering more kind of traditional financial joint ventures.
And I think, Patrick, I mean, that obviously makes sense. I mean, I've from personal experience, and some folks on the line may share this too. I mean, I have seen instances with both health plans and providers where actually a failure to define this really has negatively impacted the outcome. So there's a lot of sense there. So okay, you get your team nailed down. Then what?
So once you know who your friends are, right?
Oh,
It's really time to do the hard and detailed work, which is to start making going from very broad sense to very specific sense, and kind of what does success look like, and how can we seek agreement and buy-in from all stakeholders around a common agreement on success. So some questions that come to mind, kind of going broad and maybe then flying at lower altitudes, is what's in our contracts, right? How are we rewarded or penalized in some cases based on the agreements that exist between provider and payer? Oftentimes those are spelled out. Maybe sometimes they could be done in more specificity, but that's a different conversation. And that's going to ultimately drive, okay, what are those levers that we can pull, so to speak, to impact success? How do we want to go about doing it? Right? What are the various methods that we can deploy given our internal capabilities? By how much, right? It's very important that we get specific. What is the impact that we're looking to have? How soon? We want to tie these goals and bind them to a time period so we know how to measure our performance and our progress over time. And then what roles and actions are required for us to reach our goal? Right? So when it comes to getting down to that level and now talking about what assets we have within our organization to address these various topics, we would definitely encourage you to do your best to match each task or component with the appropriate role from a workflow and value perspective. If an external system, whether it's the payer, the HIE, or the provider partner, regardless of whom, but if an external system is notifying you about a particular gap in care or something that you need to now follow up on, or that it involves, clinical decision making, it's one thing to just kind of slap it on the physician's plate and say, here, go complete this order entry, versus, maybe being a little more thoughtful and routing it to a nurse or a medical assistant, and then having them determine when it's appropriate to forward that notification to the physician when it's already, it's ready, it's teed up in the EHR for review and approval.
yeah, and I think, I mean, that's a lot to unpack in itself there. I mean, there's way more to performance modeling than I think we can really address today. But I guess it is worth noting that the analytical capabilities evolve as more parties become more interoperable.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And we even kind of teased this out a little bit as kind of chicken and the egg, is, your strategies will necessarily have to involve as you become more interoperable with the partners, because you're effectively getting, new signals provided to you as more data is presented, and you're managing that new data. Really, the next step, and this is really important, is to develop a clear understanding and also to gain acknowledgement around the accountability for those actions that you all will need to complete, necessary to get closer to your goals. And that goes across departments and roles. Because at the end of the day, that's really what we're talking about, right? Especially on the provider side, is increased accountability. From a payer perspective, this step might pose some additional challenge compared to status quo, right? In our interactions, payers tend to be well more departmentally siloed, right? I think back to having meetings with payers where, We might have 20 folks in the room from a payer across 8 or 9 different departments. And just like we're introducing ourselves as a vendor, they're introducing themselves to each other because they've never interacted with each other before, right? So as a result, more effort's really necessary to kind of break down those barriers and to create a culture of cross-departmental collaboration. This also makes it more challenging when tackling accountability for items that require that cross-departmental collaboration. And kind of borrowing from my kind of 50,000 down to 10,000 foot descent approach earlier, one suggested framework is to really start asking yourself questions at the highest levels of the organization, and then trickling that kind of decision making and I guess line of questioning down throughout to even the smallest unit, right? The individual end user, kind of starting with the end in mind and backing toward that goal, and then understanding what can interoperability do to really help me advance that. So really kind of plain Jane starting is, what am I accountable for, right? This base question, again, can be asked at all levels of the organization. If I'm on the payer side and I'm a network facing performance manager, that might mean that I'm accountable for the outcomes of the practices and facilities that are assigned to me in my region. If I'm, that ACO executive director, I might be accountable for the very specific outcomes relative to the quality improvement, risk adjustment, kind of benchmark management, and shared savings of our next generation ACO. It also gives us an opportunity to identify what are the things that I'm missing, right? What are the things that I'm accountable for that might require that said collaboration. So once we really clearly define what is it that I'm specifically or individually accountable for, we flow into, well, how do I manage it, right? And that gives us an opportunity to kind of reflect upon the current state as it exists in your organizations, right? What systems do we have at our disposal today? What workflows are already in place today? Are they supportive of value-based care in their current state? And if not, how must they change? While we're going through and implementing various workflow changes or introducing new workflows, can they be improved? Do we have an opportunity to identify some legacy bottlenecks and use it as an opportunity to kind of optimize in general, even if they don't necessarily touch value-based care? And then again, does this require help from external resources, right? What new systems and workflows need to be deployed or designed to support these, whether they're from internal resources, those are new conversations with new vendors and partners, or otherwise. And most importantly, and kind of tying it back to interoperability, is what's the information that I need, right? Workflows are great, but workflows only work once we introduce that information and start converting that to knowledge. Taking that the next step deeper, it's okay, once we define what we need from an information perspective, what's the data that's driving that information? What are those indicators, those metrics, or those KPIs, right? Those key performance indicators for which I'm responsible that kind of fall under my own personal accountability umbrella. Are we responsible for calculating them, right? Are we the ones that are the engine that's really driving it, or are we just being delivered these from an external source? Is somebody else interpreting them on our behalf, or do they need to interpret them on our behalf? Who are they, if that's the case? And then once we have those metrics, what do I need to actually track those metrics, right? Because it's not like we take a point in time and say, hey, January 1, 2021, this is our metric, and then we hit the snooze button for a year. How do I track that and measure it over time such that I can manage performance? And we really try to encourage, thinking at the atomic level. Who has this data? How frequently do I need to see this data? Ideally, right? As a fallback position, you might say, how frequently can this data be provided to me by those suppliers? Do standards exist that can assist me with obtaining this data? If so, which ones? Are the providers or the senders and the recipients capable of exchanging using that standard? If not, can we at least seek some agreement about a one-to-one standard such that it's consistent and reliable, or that we can at least get it in some type of predictable format? And then lastly, where do I need this displayed? Does it go right to the doctors? Do we need some intermediary kind of level to filter that? Is it routed to support staff, care managers, schedules?
And Patrick, I think you've got some great suggestions there, and this is all extremely thorough. Hopefully, there's folks on the line feverishly kind of scribbling these down. But what would you say to people who think to themselves that this is too much, or in some cases, dare I say, this is too obvious?
Yeah, absolutely. And it might sound aggressively specific, but clear acknowledgement of accountability at that granular level is required. I would position to avoid that. You get the bad news report, and then you have that conversation. Well, Mark, I thought you were responsible for X, Y, Z, and you say, oh, Patrick, I thought you were responsible for X, Y, Z. Kind of finger pointing at each other if something again goes south, right? Especially when we're dealing with changing a fee-for-service system that has been deeply rooted for over 50 years, or the fact that many value-based programs require collaboration where we're taking a team-based approach and kind of dividing the accountability among disparate departments, let alone disparate entities and entirely independent organizations. Not to mention, you typically, again, only have these conversations once you have an undesirable event or an adverse outcome. The example I think of is, if you've ever sent an email and on the to line, you send it to like 5 or 6 people and you're asking questions, expecting them all to chime in, but nobody responds because they were all relying on the other person to respond. It really is the same concept. And, the bottom line is that, not really understanding the problems you face in detail will create barriers to further adopting value-based care and specifically assuming that downside risk.
Amen.
And you're spot on there, Patrick, for sure. I mean, I can't help feel that last comment was actually directed at me there, with regard to the CCs on email. But you do raise a good point, a really good point on the importance of accountability. Maybe as a next progression, I mean, how does all of this translate to interoperability?
Yes. So having that deep level of understanding of your very specific problems and the needs that then kind of grow out of those problems will help in many regards. First, it provides for a way more informed evaluation of solutions, whether those are or those can be found within your kind of existing systems or with the resources that you have kind of internally available to you, or whether it's the opposite, it drives you to realize that there's a gap there and that it's going to drive you out to market for additional help from various products or services. And it's okay to ask for help. In case of standards-based communication, the documentation of your needs will help you discern what the best tool for any given job will be when you have the option of multiple pathways, right? If we've got 3 or 4 different methods for getting the same type of data, really getting that granular level detail will help you identify what's the best tool for the job. As a golfer or somebody who pretends to be a golfer sometimes on weekends, I'm trying to constantly pick the right club for the right shot, right? We want to be very specific in the way we define those problems so we know which club to pull out of the bag. Lastly, it also helps identify where that industry level kind of generally accepted interoperability may not be available to us yet, which would further inform your discussions with those external parties about, how do I best obtain what I need if we don't have a standards-based pathway available to us.
Okay. No, that makes sense. So I guess the thought is to engage the end users or consumers of the data that's been delivered through interoperability to help ultimately develop the interoperability strategy. I guess then, as a follow-on, those same consumers can also then serve as your subject matter experts to help identify gaps or holes in what's needed, maybe versus what's readily available.
Completely.
Well, can I say something? This is Gene Morris with We Know Exchange.
Mm-hmm.
With interoperability, there needs to be, in order to successfully complete what it is that you're trying to complete, there has to be some sort of guidance and laws and rules and requirements. And then upon that being established, there needs to be a policing mechanism to make sure that what has been planned out is followed. And that's the biggest problem. We Know Exchange is an e-prescribing platform for doctors to use for free to, to compose a compliant electronic prescription of a controlled substance that they are mandated to transfer electronically. So we know Exchange, for example, doctors are filling out and compliantly completing a electronic prescription of a controlled substance. We are sending it the transfer information to all the chains. The big chain pharmacies are not in compliance. They're information blocking. They're taking the EHI.
So, Gene, if I may, I mean, you raise a really good point. You raise a really good point that stewardship is just as important, if not more important, than some of the ideation in of itself.
Especially
I mean,
from provider
phenomenal.
to provider. That's correct. Go ahead.
Yeah, a lot of agreement there. If I may, just want to allow Patrick time just to put a bow around some of the wrap-up comments. We will definitely have time to bring the group into a more substantive discussion, and maybe Gene, we can start with picking up on you when we get to that point. So Patrick, I'll give the floor back to you. I know we were focusing on some of the external strategy items, maybe some of the latter points on the thread for today. So I'll give the floor back to you. I'll let you just drive the last few comments forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've kind of talked about internal strategy and maybe dovetailing a little bit about what Gene said, because it actually, I think, does help transition to an extent into what we're about to cover. But as I'd mentioned, kind of by nature of these folks or your external stakeholders being external, therefore you have less control over them. You're way less likely to be accountable, quote unquote, to each other in the literal sense, right? And that you're not signing their paychecks, right? For example, might be the most literal sense, but rather we have to rely on expectations and trust and kind of what was mentioned, kind of enforcement, understanding what happens if we don't meet expectations or we fail to meet that trust. And the provider payer relationship a little bit different, given that there are contracts, but those contracts really can be used as vehicles to better define and specify the things that we know will be required from each party to succeed. So similarly to kind of defining your internal team is, let's define our external team, right? Who are the external stakeholders that can positively or negatively impact our success? Right. This kind of tends to be that kind of that nebulous continuum of care that's often referred to, where you have providers and facilities and community programs kind of within your, even payers within your communities or your ecosystems.
And I think that makes a lot of sense. Again, I think we've had some comments on that earlier, just about inventorying external variables as folks look to share risk. So again, for folks on the line, as they've identified players in their ecosystem, that kind of makes sense. But meaningful change needs focus. So in your view, what's next?
Right. So now we understand kind of what that atlas or that map looks like of our friends and neighbors, right, in our communities. So when we want to create a plan around external engagement, first step is who do we assign to serve as our, I call them our diplomats for each of those components. Right. So we'll map out, or you'll want to map out how each stakeholder can impact you, and develop a list of expectations to share with each of them. This will be more easily done with, kind of at the facility level if we're talking about engaging a SNF network or a group of home health agencies than it is on a provider by provider basis, just kind of given the disparity in the plurality, but true for both nonetheless. And, one of the ways, and we kind of position this up at the top, was at the top of the presentation is, let's start with the patient outcomes in mind. Let's get that agreement in place before we might have to cover topics where they might be a little bit more sensitive or more difficult ground to cover. Let's also be mindful that these relationships involve a give and a take approach, right? They're not a one-way street. So don't be afraid to be transparent around not only what you want to demand from that external stakeholder, but be willing to share the value that you think you can bring to them and the needs that they have relative to the accountability that everybody shares. So for example, an ACO, it might be reasonable for an ACO to expect that a SNF in their network should keep a good control over the average length of stay for their patients, while the SNF in turn might reasonably expect that ACO to provide some resource and investment into information they need to better track episodes for the patients that are in the ACO. A payer might reasonably expect a provider to reduce, or a provider entity to reduce readmission rates, while the provider might reasonably expect the payer to offer some support around, again, transitional care management. And in that case, between payer and provider, that support might mean different things, right? That might be resources like traditional, case management, or enhancements to case management departments. It could be reimbursement. We've seen out there, care management stipends of $1, $2, $3, $4 PM to say, we're not necessarily centralizing it. We want to keep that function kind of in a more federated model. Great, that's worked as well. The interesting thing is it's ripe to have these dialogues from both the provider and the payer perspective. Providers, unfortunately and tragically, are now very aware of a system where if you're relying on volume, that the volume may just not be there. And now many of them are transitioning to kind of account for maybe lost volume moving forward, and at least in the face-to-face sense, and transitioning to telehealth. From the payer perspective, it's also ripe because many payers are looking to, spend dollars and invest in the quality improvement activities that can help them kind of balance their medical loss ratios, given that flatlining of volume over the past 12, 14 months.
And Patrick, just conscious of time, that may be a good bombshell to leave things on as we open up for Q&A. I think the thing I would say, Sam, before I give the floor back to you, I think there's been some wonderful anecdote, Patrick, for the last 50 odd minutes, and hopefully for the folks on the line, we've enriched some perspectives on approaches and maybe pitfalls to be aware of as it relates to interoperability and value-based care. For our attendees, one thing that I'm hopeful of is that each of you acknowledge that the status quo is not really an option for our industry. Further reforms are always going to be looming. I guess the question for each of you is, do you choose to drive that reform yourself, or do you want to wait until you're told? And certainly from my perspective, I know which one I would pick. So Sam, I'll give the floor to you to maybe facilitate from here, and we'll see where it takes us.
Thank you so much, Mark. Again, just to reiterate for all of our participants, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box in your Zoom webinar, just so that way we don't miss any questions and we can make sure that we follow up with you if we don't have a chance to get to your questions. The first one that I have is, I've seen recently that on the whole, those in value-based arrangements with downside risk component are outperforming those with, quote, upside only, unquote, incentives. What are your thoughts?
That's a great question. Because it's true, and it also kind of gives us another signal as to kind of the task ahead of us. But generally speaking, people typically invest more into areas that have potential negative outcomes than they do positive upside. I would ask you to please not cite my sources, but I've read about studies showing that people are multiple times more likely to act out of fear of a loss than they are out of a promise of a gain. That observation is really again, not just a reflection of the current state, but it's also kind of a predictor of the future state and what's coming down, right? So historically, downside risk has been really voluntary, optional, or maybe at best slowly developing. If we agree that we're approaching the fiscal cliff relative to healthcare and maybe even elsewhere based on some of those staggering things we saw earlier in the presentation, certainly advancing toward the cliff faster than our brakes are allowing us to slow down. The days of voluntary downside risk are numbered, right? And given the amount of cultural change, the non-technical stuff that we focused on today, and the advanced planning necessary to really manage that downside risk, I would really suggest that people start thinking critically now and start planning now for how to do it, if not, yesterday.
Sam, sorry to interrupt. I guess conscious of time, there's maybe some final thoughts we could leave the group with, and maybe with some of the other questions that may be on the line, we can take those as follow-ups, if that makes sense.
Sure. Do you guys have any final thoughts that you'd like to leave the group with?
I'm glad you asked. I mean, super quick, right? I mean, I think from my perspective, one of the thoughts that I'd want to give the group is, technical feasibility doesn't always equal practicality. As I say here, while interoperability does provide, certain building blocks, it's definitely upon us as recipients or constituents of those solutions to help interpret the data we're receiving. And clinicians especially are tired of additional administrative burden, especially without adequate support. So again, technical feasibility is not always practical.
Yeah, to add on that, don't be afraid to not move forward. Don't be afraid to move forward just because there isn't an interoperability acronym available at your disposal, right? Your business needs are going to mature and evolve faster, that we are going to be able to get all of our best and brightest into the same room to agree on all of this stuff. It is possible to get more localized standards agreed upon where there are trusted exchanges of data in consistent, predictable formats, such that great progress can be made and still be accountable to each other, right? Those external stakeholders, including your vendors, right? Because we're really there to kind of help pick up the slack, so to speak, right? The data is delivered to us through the interoperability, but then it's really incumbent upon us as partners, vendor and client, to kind of help fill out that last mile.
And I think the last comment, Sam, I have for the group really is more of a call to action, and hopefully today was a good example of this. But we all need to have conversations. The more we have these types of conversations, the better prepared we're all going to be to move forward in value-based care, no matter what the current interoperability landscape looks like. So I think it's just more, I guess the last comment would be about encouraging dialogue, and whether it's reaching out to myself or Patrick after this call, absolutely happy to continue the dialogue for anyone who's interested. So Sam, I'll give the floor to you, and thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Mark and Patrick, and thank you to all of our participants for registering for the event and also for joining us today. I will be emailing you the slide deck as well as the link to the recorded webinar, and feel free to share it with anybody else in your organization that you think might benefit from all of the fantastic information that Patrick and Mark shared with us today. But I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.